The call to the parking lot was still on his phone when Hugo Carrington stepped out of his truck and saw the look on the young man's face. Hugo had driven 4 hours from the farm in Culpeper with the windows down and a country station playing low on the radio. And he had not thought once about the state of his clothes until he was standing beneath the copper lights of Meridian House, and the young man at the entrance podium looked at him the way people look at something that has appeared in the wrong place, not with anger yet, just with the flat, settled certainty of a man who has already decided what he's seeing and does not plan to revisit that decision. His nameplate read Blake Sherwood. He was 40 or so, square-jawed, wearing a jacket with decorative epaulets that served no purpose beyond signaling that he considered himself the kind of person who wore epaulets. He was standing at the top of the stone steps with the posture of someone who had been given authority recently and had not yet learned what it was for. Hugo was 63 years old and wearing the flannel shirt he'd put on at 5 that morning to fix the fence section that a storm had brought down 2 nights before. His boots were work boots. His jacket was the brown canvas one with the torn left pocket he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years and kept forgetting. His hair was silver and windblown from 4 hours of open windows. It had not occurred to him to check a mirror before he left the farm, because it had not occurred to him that he would need to. He had been a member of Meridian House for 31 years. His late wife Ruth had given him the membership as a gift for his first year on the federal bench, wrapped in silver paper with a card that said in her handwriting, "For the man who claims he doesn't need anything, you need somewhere to think." R. He had thought there for 31 years. Ruth had thought there beside him for 27 of those, at the small table in the south reading room where the afternoon light came in sideways through the lead glass windows. She had been gone for 2 years and 4 months, and he still sometimes turned toward that room when he entered the building, just for the half-second before he remembered. Tonight was not an ordinary visit. Tonight, Meridian House was holding the 3rd annual Carrington Ruth Memorial Scholarship Dinner. 4 students, public law, Ruth's name on the program, organized by Hugo's daughter Isabel, and funded by an endowment of $2.1 million that Hugo had committed 3 years ago because Ruth had believed, more than Hugo had ever believed anything, that the law existed to protect the people who needed it most, and that most of those people would never in their lives be able to afford a lawyer who understood that. He had not planned to speak at the dinner. He had planned to sit near the back, listen to the students, eat whatever was being served, and drive home by 10. He was thinking about the toast when Blake Sherwood said, "Can I help you?" The tone was the question's entire content. It did not mean, "May I assist you?" It meant, "What are you doing here?" Hugo Carrington, member since '94. "I'm here for the scholarship dinner." Blake glanced down at the tablet, propped on the podium, and scrolled with the deliberate slowness of a man performing thoroughness rather than practicing it. "I don't see a Carrington. It wouldn't be on the guest list. I'm a member. I don't need to RSVP." "Sir," Blake said, with a small pause before the word that turned it into something else entirely. "Our events this evening are for registered attendees and members whose accounts are currently in good standing. I'll need you to step to the side while I verify." A couple in evening wear was ascending the steps. Blake's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the way it does when an audience arrives and a performance recalibrates for it. He smiled at the couple and waved them through before returning to his scrolling. "My account is in good standing," Hugo said. "I'm sure it is, sir." "Then look it up, member number 1147. Blake looked up with the expression of someone who has decided a conversation has run past the length he finds acceptable. "Sir, I understand you believe you're a member, and I'm not saying you aren't. What I'm saying is that I cannot allow anyone who claims membership to walk into a private event without verification. You understand. Standards." He gestured toward a cushioned bench along the exterior wall, the sort of bench placed specifically for people who have no choice but to wait and to be seen waiting. A second couple arrived. Blake greeted them warmly. They went in. Hugo stood where he was. He had spent 22 years on the federal bench. He had sentenced men to decades in prison. He had overturned wrongful convictions and written opinions that became precedent in 4 circuits. He was not a man who was easily rattled by another man's contempt. But he was standing in front of the building that held Ruth's name in tonight's program, and there was something about being turned away from that, specifically, that sat differently than any other slight he had endured in 63 years. He did not move to the bench. "Member number 1147, he said again, evenly. "Hugo Carrington, founding patron of this club. Tonight's event is named in part for my late wife. If you pull up the account, you'll see all of that. I'm asking you to pull it up." Blake set the tablet on the podium and folded his hands on top of it, the gesture of someone performing patient authority. Sir, I don't want to make this uncomfortable for anyone, but you need to understand that we have guests arriving, and I cannot have the entrance held up by someone who he stopped. Recalibrated. Let the rest of the sentence remain unspoken, but perfectly legible. By someone who looks the way you look. Someone who what? Hugo said. Blake did not answer. He looked past Hugo's shoulder and raised his chin slightly. Owen Rafferty, head of security, broad-shouldered, late 30s, 8 years at Meridian House, stepped forward from his post near the column with the expression of a man who already knows he is unhappy about what he is being silently asked to do. From inside the building, through the tall glass doors, the lobby glowed warm. Tables with white linens were visible past the foyer. Guests in evening wear moved between them. And from a service corridor just inside the left wing of the entrance, half hidden by the door, he held open with his shoulder, Felix Garza watched. Felix was 57, a facilities supervisor with 11 years at Meridian House. He had observed Blake Sherwood's 6-month tenure with the careful, quiet attention of a man who has learned that what he sees matters less than what he can afford to say about it. He had watched Blake turn away a man in a wheelchair last February, a member of 14 years, citing a private event that had not, in fact, restricted member entry. He had watched Blake address the kitchen staff in a register reserved, in polite society, for correcting children. He had watched and said nothing. Because Felix was on a work authorization that came up for renewal every 3 years, and the last person in a similar position who had filed a complaint at a place like this had not had their contract renewed, and Felix had a daughter in her 2nd year at VCU and a mother in a care facility in Falls Church. Saying nothing was the tax he paid each month to be able to keep paying his other bills. He watched Blake nod toward Owen. He watched Owen step forward. He moved his mop in slow circles and looked at the floor and hated himself the way he had hated himself, quietly and without relief, for the better part of a year. Inside the lobby, the elevator opened and Gideon Marsh walked out. Gideon was 41, a partner at Calder and Marsh in Richmond, and he had clerked for Hugo Carrington for 2 years directly after law school, a period he still described, without irony, as the education that had made everything else possible. He was wearing a charcoal suit and carrying a glass of sparkling water, and he had come down to check on the seating arrangements when he looked through the glass doors and saw the man standing at the top of the steps. He did not immediately process what he was seeing. Then he did. He set his glass on the nearest surface and walked to the doors and pushed them open. "Judge Carrington," he said. Blake turned. Owen stopped. Gideon stepped past Owen and stood beside Hugo, not loudly, not with any performance of it, just standing, making it clear that where this person was standing was where he was standing too. "Gideon," Hugo said. Something in his voice shifted. Not relief exactly, but the sound of a man who has been holding something at arm's length and has just been allowed to put it down. "How long has he been out here?" Gideon said. His eyes stayed on Hugo. The question was directed at Blake. Blake opened his mouth. "Sir, I was simply—" "How long?" A small silence. A couple approaching from the parking lot slowed their pace, reading the air. "I couldn't verify his membership," Blake said. "We have a process." "His member number is 1147. Gideon's voice stayed level. It was the voice of a man who had argued before 3 federal circuits and understood precisely when not to raise his volume. He has held that number since 1994. He is a founding patron. The scholarship dinner inside this building right now, the one with the 4 students who flew in from across the state, bears the name of his late wife and is funded by his personal endowment. He paused one beat. "Did you look him up?" Blake said nothing. "Did you type the member number into the system?" The silence answered it. From behind Blake, the glass doors opened from the inside. A woman in her late 50s came through, short, iron-haired, moving in a dark blazer with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent 3 decades running this building and had long since stopped needing to raise her voice to be heard. Cecile Wofford had been Meridian House's general manager since 2001, and someone from the events staff had found her in her office 4 minutes ago and said something that had brought her through the building at a pace her staff had not previously witnessed. She walked past Blake without looking at him. She walked past Owen. She walked to Hugo, and there was something in her expression that was not pity and not anger. Something quieter than both. Something that looked, if you had to name it, like shame. "Hugo," she said, just that. "Cecil," he said. "I am so sorry." The words were simple, and she meant them completely. "Please come inside. Isabel has been asking for you." She held the door. Hugo walked in. He did not look at Blake as he passed. He said nothing. The absence of any remark was, by then, the fullest thing in the room. Cecile turned back in the doorway. "Mr. Sherwood," she said, "please come to my office when the last guests have arrived. Bring your tablet." It was not a request, and Blake understood that it was not a request. Owen watched him and said nothing. He would stay at his post and think about what he had almost done, and he would be thinking about it for a long time after tonight. In the service corridor, Felix Garza leaned his mop against the wall. He stood up straight for the first time in several hours. He did not know yet what would happen, but he knew what he had seen. And for the first time in 11 years, he was aware that what he had seen might be asked about by someone with the authority to do something with the answer. The scholarship dinner began at 7:15. Isabel Carrington had inherited her mother's way of entering a room. Quietly, without announcement, so that you only noticed her after she had already been there for several minutes. She was 34, a civil rights attorney with the Legal Aid Society of Virginia, and she had organized this dinner for the third consecutive year, because Ruth had always said that the measure of a person was not what they accumulated, but what they set in motion for people who came after them. She found her father near the south reading room window, the table, the sideways light, the angle that had always been Ruth's preferred, and put her hand on his arm and said nothing about the entrance or the parking lot or any of it. Because she had spoken to Cecile and understood, and there was nothing to say that her hand on his arm did not already say better. Hugo patted her hand once. They went to their table. The 4 students were introduced one by one: a young man from Roanoke who wanted to practice immigration law, a woman from Richmond's East End pursuing housing advocacy, a student from rural Southwest Virginia who had not met a lawyer until he was in high school and had needed one badly by then, a young woman from Norfolk who was the first person in 4 generations of her family in Virginia to attend law school. Each of them spoke for a few minutes. Each said something true, the way young people who have had to work for things tend to say true things when they are finally given a moment to speak. Hugo listened the way he had listened to testimony for 22 years, fully, hands still on the table, his eyes on whoever was speaking. When it was his turn, he stood up without prepared remarks. "Ruth," he said, and stopped and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was what he did when deciding whether to say the thing he was actually thinking. Ruth would have hated being honored. She would have sat in the back. She would have spent the whole dinner asking the students questions and deflect everyone asked. Few people smiled. The room was quiet. She believed, he continued, that the law is only as good as the people who show up to practice it, not the people who can afford it, not the people who look the part, the people who show up, regardless of how they arrive, regardless of what they're wearing, regardless of whether the person at the door decides they look like they belong. He paused. Something crossed his face and was replaced by steadiness. She was right about that. She was right about most things, if I'm being honest with myself. I've gotten better at that since she left. He thanked the students. He sat down. Isabel was looking at her water glass. Her eyes were bright. At the end of the evening, as the last guests gathered their coats, Felix was restacking chairs near the service entrance when Cecile Wofford found him. "Felix," she said, "do you have a few minutes?" He set down the chair. He nodded. She told him she was not there to make trouble for him. She told him that anything he shared would be attributed only to a staff member with direct knowledge in any HR documentation, unless he chose otherwise. She told him. She understood the reasons people stayed quiet, and she was not there to judge them, only to ask whether he was willing, now, to tell her what he knew. Felix looked at the stack of chairs. He looked at his hands. Then he told her. The man in the wheelchair last February, the way Blake spoke to the kitchen staff. 3 other members he had watched directed to that bench over 6 months. An elderly black woman who had held her membership for 22 years, a young South Asian couple there for a private party. A man on a cane who had been told the elevator was under maintenance when it was not. He told her everything. It took 40 minutes, and Cecile wrote none of it down because she did not need to. She was the kind of woman who remembered what mattered. When he finished, she put her pen in her pocket. "Thank you, Felix," she said. "I should have said something sooner." "Yes," she said, not unkindly, "but you said it now, and now is what I have to work with." She shook his hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires. Then she went to find Blake Sherwood. The meeting lasted 38 minutes. Blake brought his tablet, as instructed. He offered 4 separate explanations for the evening, each one displacing the last like a man testing ice and finding it thin in every direction. Cecile let him finish each explanation before asking the next question. By the fourth, Blake had stopped looking at the tablet and was looking at the wall. His termination was effective immediately, for cause, with a written finding Cecile would file with the board the following morning. She cited the entrance camera footage, time-stamped, preserved, showing Blake typing nothing into the member search system during the 7 minutes between Hugo's arrival and Gideon Marsh's appearance at the doors. She cited the pattern Felix had described. She cited a clause in Meridian House's founding charter that Hugo Carrington, as a founding patron and retired federal judge, had helped draft, one that prohibited any staff member from denying entry to a member on any basis other than documented cause. Owen escorted Blake from the building in silence, with his eyes forward, in the manner of someone carrying out a task he has complicated feelings about and has decided to do correctly anyway. Owen would not be terminated. He would be counseled, and he would sit across from Cecile the following week and be asked what kind of employee he wanted to be when no one was watching. He would answer, honestly. He would be given the chance to demonstrate it. Hugo Carrington left Meridian House at 9:47. He paused in the lobby near the South Reading Room, stood there a moment with his canvas jacket over one arm. Gideon found him. Need a ride to your truck? No, Hugo said, just standing. Gideon stood beside him and asked nothing. She would have thought the whole thing was ridiculous, Hugo said. The endowment. The dinner. The name on the program. She would have said we should just mail the checks and let the kids get on with their lives. Probably, Gideon said. She was right about that, too. He put on his jacket. The left pocket was still torn. He thought now that he probably would not replace it. He said goodnight to Gideon and to Cecile, who was coming out of her office with a leather folio and the expression of a woman who had several more hours of work ahead and had long since made peace with that. He walked out through the front doors, down the stone steps, across the parking lot, and got into his truck. He sat for a moment before starting it. The copper lights of Meridian House reflected off his windshield. Inside, the last of the dinner guests were filtering out through the lobby, their voices low and warm. He thought about what Blake Sherwood had seen when he'd looked at him on those steps. A man in flannel and work boots, wind-blown and ordinary, with no visible claim to any of this. He thought about the bench along the exterior wall where Blake had gestured for him to wait. He thought about how many people had sat on that bench, and about Felix Garza in the service corridor doorway, watching and saying nothing. Not because he was a coward, but because the world had arranged itself in a way that made speaking a luxury Felix could not afford. And that was a thing worth being angry about, if you were going to be angry at the right things. He thought about the young woman from Norfolk, who had held the microphone with both hands and thanked specifically a legal aid attorney, who had handled her family's eviction case 12 years ago when she was 8 years old, and who she had decided that night she wanted to become. He started the truck. He drove home with the windows down and the radio off, through roads he and Ruth had driven 100 times, past the exit she used to make him take so they could stop at the diner with the bad coffee and the excellent pie, past the dark fields where the fence posts threw short shadows in the moonlight. He thought. She set things in motion, he thought. That is what you do when you cannot stay. You set things in motion and you trust the people who remain to carry them. He did not cry until he turned into the farm road. Then he did. Briefly and without apology, the way a man cries when he's alone, and what he is carrying has gotten heavy enough that it needs to be put down for a moment, before he picks it back up and goes inside, and makes himself a cup of coffee and goes to bed. In the morning, he called Isabel. Dad, she said, how are you? Fine, he said. I want to talk about next year. Can we add a 5th scholarship? A pause. Yes, absolutely yes. Good, he said. I'll call Cecile. He poured his coffee. Through the kitchen window, the fence he had repaired 2 days ago ran straight and even across the far field. The morning light was coming in at a low angle, the way it did in October, the way Ruth had always said was the best light of the year for everything. He drank his coffee. He picked up the phone. He went back to work. That is how it changes. Not in a single night of justice, though justice matters. Not in one man's humiliation and another man's vindication, though those things are real and necessary. It changes in the morning after. In the decision to add one more scholarship, to go back through one more door, this time without a sign above it telling you that you belong, because you have decided that you do not need the sign. It changes in Felix Garza, walking into Cecile Wofford's office 3 weeks later, voluntarily on his lunch break, to report something else he had seen that morning with a guest, because he had learned by then that someone would listen, that it was worth the cost of speaking, that the cost was lower than he had spent 11 years believing it was. It changes in the young woman from Norfolk passing the bar 2 years later, framing the certificate, hanging it on the wall of a small legal aid office in a part of the city that needs exactly the kind of lawyer she has decided to be. It changes in Isabel Carrington at the 5th annual dinner, standing at the podium with her father at the back table near the south reading room window, saying, "My mother believed that dignity is not something the room gives you. She believed you carry it with you, and the only question is whether the people around you will recognize it or refuse to." She also believed that refusing to recognize it in someone else says nothing true about them and everything true about you. It changes in the students in those seats, leaning forward, writing that down.